Hi everyone, Blind Dweller here. Continuing on from my previous video, I'm excited to share with you today part 2 of the Francis Bacon documentary, A Tainted Talent. If you haven't seen part 1 as of yet, or if you're new and just happen to stumble across this channel, I highly recommend you stop watching this video for the time being and take a look at part 1 first, just to ensure you're up to speed with the information in this video, and to make a few things less confusing when certain people or events are reliant on context explored in part 1. Part 1 was really more of a look into Bacon's childhood, where he came from and how and where he grew up, and of course how he learned to paint. In this episode, Bacon is now on the verge of becoming a fully established and respected artist, about to unveil his first ever masterpiece, 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion. And we'll be looking into not only this work, but a vast collection of his other haunting paintings right up until the late 50s. So it looks like there is going to be a part 3 after all. But by the looks of some of your comments, it looks like the majority of you won't mind that, which is great news for me, as it allows me to research even deeper and include as much information as possible on Francis Bacon. I'm not going to make a huge introduction this time, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone's support and feedback on this series so far, and if you're a new subscriber, thank you so much and welcome to another video. This is part 2 of the story and artwork of Francis Bacon. During the years of 1943 and 1944, Britain was still a country at war, a war that was now affecting people on a global scale far more considerably than anyone had first imagined. But thankfully for London residents, the bombings were now becoming less frequent, as Germany was now forced to turn its attention towards Britain and the United States Allied Forces, Russia. The Red Army were, by this time, close to ending Adolf Hitler's campaign in Europe, and by 1945, the news would eventually surface that they were now well on their way to Berlin. This would signify that at long last, the Nazis would soon surrender, and the war was close to an end. During these final years of the war, Francis would also begin to enjoy a rather eccentric lifestyle in his new abode in South Kensington. His new townhouse of number 7 Cromwell Place was once the home of another respected artist, the pre-Raphaelite painter John Everett Millais. Francis leased and resided in the ground floor of the building. Previously a billiard room, the large space was converted into a studio equipped with a skylight. The floor above was the bombed remains of John Millais' studio space, which he used for artificial lighting. Francis would sleep in the one bedroom that the flat provided, leaving Nanny Lightfoot, who was still accompanying him, to turn the kitchen each night into a sort of makeshift bedroom. Or mentioned by art historian and former friend of Francis, John Richardson, in the Brush with Violence documentary, she would quote, "sleep on a kitchen table." It should also be mentioned that Francis was still part of the Air Raid Precautions Service, and bombardment from German aircraft was still occasional, though now that the Blitz was coming to an end, his services were required less often, allowing him more ample time to focus on his painting in his new studio. By 1945, the war was now on the verge of ending entirely, and the city was keen to begin reclaiming its once vibrant culture, including the art scene. The time for Francis could not be better, as not only had his confidence in his own art improved, but so had his confidence with other people, which could have played a part into creating the opportunity to truly leave his mark in art history at the Lefebvre Gallery in London in April that year. Francis would begin a project, a triptych that would later be titled 3 Studies for Figures at the Base of a Crucifixion in 1944 over the space of 2 weeks in his new South Kensington home studio. Though it should be mentioned that there are some interesting fragments of Francis practicing or perfecting his designs for the 3 studies over the years prior to his finished masterpiece. Francis was still anxious to experiment and improve on his work-in-progress subject of the crucifixion, and so the theme would once again make an appearance in his work. The 3 studies would be created with the mediums of oil and pastel, and for economy purposes at the time when the city was recovering from a war, Francis would use light sandala boards rather than canvas. Motivated by newfound confidence in his creativity and his apparent rebellious attitude spurred on from a party lifestyle, Bacon's work on the three studies would come together in a unique mindset that he would later comment on as follows. I was in a bad mood of drinking, and I did it under tremendous hangovers and drink. I sometimes hardly knew what I was doing. I think perhaps the drink helped me to be a bit freer. It should also be mentioned, Francis was finding yet more ways to fund his art, such as through his partner at the time, Eric Hall, who was not only Bacon's lover, but also a valuable patron. Eric Hall was a leading figure for the Tory party and very wealthy, which was also intertwined with his appreciation for art, as well as his rather more secret life. On the surface, Hall was a very respected man, a loving husband and father, and was considered to be very straightforward and conservative by nature. But he also led a concealed existence. Much like Francis, he enjoyed gambling, drinking heavily, and of course had a secret relationship with Francis, and would be heavily involved in the young artist's life for at least 20 years. From a certain point of view, this could be an early glimpse into how Francis would openly admit that he enjoyed living most aspects of his life with a lot of risk. Not only because of his gambling habits, within itself is completely reliant on chance, but this early relationship with Hall was completely playing with fate. Should their affair ever be discovered, this would ruin not only Bacon's reputation, but it would mean the end of absolutely everything for Hall. Eric Hall would eventually buy and donate Bacon's Three Figures triptych to the Tate Gallery roughly 10 years later in 1953. Had it not been for this dangerous yet beneficial relationship, it could be argued that the three studies would have ultimately slipped into obscurity. Francis was continuing to make valuable friends in the art world, thanks to his charm and extravagant casino parties. One such friend and fellow artist that would prove to be crucial to Bacon's success with the three studies would be neo-romantic artist Graham Sutherland. Despite being from completely different backgrounds and sharing completely different temperaments, the pair had grown close in the 1940s, and Sutherland in particular was a keen admirer of Bacon during this period. Sutherland was already an established artist with noteworthy connections in the art scene, and was soon due to exhibit his art alongside other fellow artists, such as the popular sculpturist at the time Henry Moore, at what used to be the Lefebvre Gallery in April 1945, and he was keen to exhibit the work of his friend Francis Bacon as well. In the early 20th century, it was considered to be one of the most lucrative galleries in the city, exhibiting artwork from the likes of Salvador Dali, L.S. Lowry, and René Magritte, just to name a few. Francis was not originally considered to feature on the bill for the exhibition until another artist had dropped out from the event, which led Sutherland to eventually recommend Francis Bacon as an ideal replacement by pulling one or two strings. This new opportunity for Francis would propel his motivation. After so many years of scrapping and editing paintings, he was finally ready to complete and release some art once again. Bacon was asked if he could provide at least 4 or 5 paintings, and so he decided he would include his figure in a landscape painting, and of course, his 3 studies. And by the time the fateful day had arrived, and from the very moment people first entered the Lefebvre Gallery and laid eyes on the terrifying works of Bacon, art would never be the same again. So even though we have already had a brief look into the 3 studies triptych in the intro of part 1, there are so many fascinating and various ways of looking at Bacon's first real masterpiece that it's certainly worth revisiting to discuss a few theories and meanings behind these 3 paintings. Let's first start off with probably the most noticeable feature in all 3 paintings, which is the colour scheme, or more specifically, the vivid red-orange background. Even this choice of colour would be enough to unsettle the public during its first reveal. The intense, fire-like colour would remind a lot of Londoners of the raging fires that came from the German bombs that the city was still recovering from at this stage. It would also heavily emphasise the shape and colour of the 3 figures in the foreground, giving off a certain depth perception that the figures are almost approaching closer to the viewer the longer you look at them. This is a result of how empty and near featureless their environment is, leaving a feeling of pure isolation, with only these terrible creatures for company, and with nowhere to hide from them. Looking closer at the first painting displayed on the left, I for many reasons actually find this to be the most interesting of the three figures. Although each figure is painted to be deliberately ambiguous regarding what they are and what features they have, the figure on the left appears to have most, if not all, of its facial features hidden behind a thick, tangled mop of hair, with only a nose or possibly an ear protruding through the hair. This will probably sound absolutely crazy, but for some reason, whenever I look at the hair, I feel really repulsed. I get that feeling of whenever you're cleaning a plug hole in the shower and you look down and you find that gross, wet, slimy, tangled ball of hair in the drain, like ugh. It might sound ridiculous, I know, but I can't help but get the same sensation whenever I look at this figure for long periods of time. Like the other figures, the neck is long and protruding downwards towards the ground, almost like a wounded or submissive animal, or otherwise an animal about to pounce or attack. Again, like the other figures, the contorted body appears to be organic, like pale skin, yet at the same time it appears almost metallic, or carved out of stone. The figure is slumped on top of a table or platform, with what I can only describe as some kind of velvet sheet or blanket draped around it. But it is wrapped tight, as if the figure is tightly bound, and is trying to pull away from someone, or something, outside of our field of view. Moving on to the painting in the middle, we see a less subdued and more hostile figure, snarling aggressively and directly towards the viewer. The body is bulbous and appears to be supported by thin, tripod legs. The neck, in comparison to the body, is also thin and protruding like a worm out of a round mass, arching downwards and curving its face towards the viewer in a manner like a snake about to strike. His face, possibly his eyes, are covered in crude bandages above the terrible mouth and exposed teeth and gums, with lips that appear swollen. Some believe this figure to be a homage to Matthias Grenefeldt's mocking of Christ, which displays Jesus Christ blindfolded again by crude white rags or bandages, which of course is also themed on the Crucifixion. Mark Stevens, one of the joint writers alongside Annalyn Swan for the biography book Francis Bacon, Revelations, gives quite an interesting and unique view on the central figure in their 2021 interview with Henny Talks.
The central figure is very, very disturbing. He's eyeless, he has a bandage around his head, great grinning mouth, but he's disturbing mostly because he's intimate. He's like a relative that you don't want to, a disagreeable relative that you don't want to know, or somebody who's going to slide down the bar and begin talking to you. In other words, he's close, and what that means is that as Londoners look at these monsters, these half-human monsters, they can't just say, oh, it was the Germans' fault. It was other people. That intimate look of that central figure says, no, the monster is also us.
Finally, we come to the remaining figure on the right. There have been many interesting observations on this figure, probably due to the fact that there are so many possible meanings behind the screaming, eyeless mouth that we see gaping towards the ceiling. WorldsBestPaintings.net described it as a silent growl. The Revelations book described the mouth as waiting for some kind of dreadful nourishment from the sky. Art critic David Sylvester described it as yawning, and another freelance art critic for The Independent, Sue Hubbard, described it as in the grips of some bestial orgasmic spasm. But I found the article from francisbacon.com quite intriguing, claiming that the mouths in the three studies are deliberately reminiscent of fascist dictators taken from propaganda images of them making speeches. Specifically a press image of a Nazi politician Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, that Bacon apparently kept in his art studio, presumably for reference. This would make sense given the time period, and the reactions of the observers still disturbed by the war. As we have already seen, Francis was frequently inspired by the images of screaming mouths and felt a strong desire to incorporate them into his work, which takes on multiple meanings in his art following his completion of the three studies, which we will get onto in due course. The body of this figure is slightly more defined than the other two, with more obvious, human-like features presented, such as the singular limb it is leaning on, resembling a clearer appearance of an arm or leg, and a slight resemblance of a rib cage under the skin that can be seen on the figure's side. Although this figure, like the other two, is blind and seemingly without eyes at all, it does possess ears, or at least one ear, which to me is a fearsome concept. It reminds me of the film Don't Breathe. The idea that a person or animal is blind but exceptionally good at hearing and uses that to their advantage to hunt or kill is just really terrifying to me. It also gives off the impression that this monster is screaming so maniacally, with its mouth open so wide, it could be in fact blocking its own eyes. Which again is a pretty uncomfortable concept for a mouth to open to a degree considered impossible for the human skull. The curious object of a brush or isolated patch of grass is probably the most mysterious aspect of a right-hand painting. I've not yet found many explanations for this, but art historian and friend of Francis, Michael Pepiot, describes the object as a sort of scrubbing brush in the Brush with Violence documentary for the BBC. And from what we know of Francis Bacon's experience growing up and caring for horses and suffering from asthma attacks brought on by animal hair and stable dust, the screaming mouth above the limb that's resting on the brush could represent gasping and fighting for air, whilst the brush could represent a body brush used to groom horses. So then could this be a representation of a traumatic childhood memory poured into this painting? Well, no, that's just me thinking out loud due to not having a chance to interview and ask Francis Bacon myself. And of course, art is always subjective, and I'd love to hear what you guys see in these paintings, especially if you see something entirely different to me, so please let me know in the comments. I was also surprised to learn that Bacon would also recreate this panel at some stage. In this painting called Fury, we can see here the painting is nearly completely identical, except this time the figure is opening its mouth to what looks like a bouquet of flowers. There is also another painting of his completed around the same time called Man in a Cup, which displays a chaotic tangled web of black brushstrokes, a ghostly grimacing mouth, and a glimpse of a fiery red background behind. Bacon would later describe his own thoughts behind the meaning of his three studies in various ways, and in various depth over the years. But he did happen to admit that the figures were particularly inspired by the furries. Wait, no, sorry, hang on. I know this could be a scandalous discovery of Francis Bacon for all we know, but let me just make sure I get this right before I offend an entire community. Oh, the Furies! The ancient Greek mythical agents of revenge who pursued Orestes in Aeschylus's tragedy. Of course, what was I thinking? Okay, moving on. During this exhibition of the Lefebvre Gallery, one English art critic for the Sunday Times, named John Russell, would famously recount his experience witnessing the paintings for the first time. In 1971, he looked back on the experience saying the shocking images were, quote, so unrelievedly awful that the mind shuts with a snap at the very sight of them. Their anatomy was half human, half animal. They were confined in a low-ceilinged, windowless and oddly proportioned space. They could bite, probe and suck, and they had very long eel-like necks, but their functioning in other respects was mysterious. He would also say quite profoundly that there was painting in England before the three studies, and painting after them, and no one can confuse the two. And sure enough, nothing could be more true, because the three studies would signal merely just the start of a collage of haunting paintings that would continue to disturb the careless and unsuspecting eye. Following the opening at the Lefebvre, curious whispers of this new Dr. Frankenstein of the art community who was creating these nightmarish monsters would begin to cascade across the city. But even so, Bacon would be reluctant at first to answer any questions or reveal any meaning in his work to the public. This would birth the romantic myth that existed for many years following the exhibition that Bacon had not painted a single piece since the 30s, until finally creating the Three Figures masterpiece at the Lefebvre in 1945. Of course, we know this is not true, but Francis would still encourage this rumour by stating, quote, I began with 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion. These of course had already been purchased by Eric Hall before the exhibition, and would later be donated to the Tate, and Bacon's cousin, Diana Watson, would purchase the additional painting, Figure in a Landscape. This singular painting, despite the impact that the 3 studies paintings created that day, was apparently more the direction that Francis Bacon had in mind for future projects. Francis by this time was beginning to move on from his influence of Picasso, which he openly admitted was another driving force behind his triptych, of which some harsh critics were not shy to point out. Francis would continue to experiment and recreate more versions of the panels from a Three Studies triptych, like we saw with the right-hand panel earlier, but noticeably in these versions his colour palette begins to change from bright red backgrounds to more subdued and eerie dark tones. His subject interests are also evolving to feature things like items of clothing, inanimate objects and flowers and other fauna, What I find most interesting about this period in his paintings is Bacon's signs of testing the limits and functions of oil paint, exploring his capabilities as a painter to see what he can create. Bacon would once mention that whenever he would paint, he would try to do so subconsciously, leaving things to chance, and so a lot of the surreal imagery we can see in these examples are purely accidental and a result of experimentation.
I make a kind of outline of the position in which I want to try, I think I want to make the image, but after that, chance and what I call accident takes over, and if anything ever does work in my case, it works from that moment when consciously I don't know what I'm doing. At that moment I'm thinking of nothing but how hopeless and impossible this thing is to achieve. And by making these marks about which I don't know how they will behave, suddenly there comes something which your instinct seizes on as being for a moment the thing by which it could begin to develop.
One of the best known examples of this style of painting would be the painting titled, and I'm being deadly serious, Painting, created in 1946, consisting of oil and pastel. I should probably mention at this point, I love Bacon's art, but some of his titles did need a little bit of work, I think. Regardless, this haunting display of meat, blood, and sharp black shadows is a result of many transformations that Francis would explain in great detail. He claimed that he was originally attempting to paint a bird descending onto a field, but as he continued, the imagery turned into an assemblage of meat carcasses. Below the carcasses, we can see a half-decapitated man with just his lower jaw remaining. Either that or the rest of his face is hidden in a shadow from a black umbrella. Conceptual artist Damien Hirst would describe this umbrella as being so strangely terrifying, despite it being such a mundane, everyday object. This could be a result of Bacon's masterful use of black paint and sharp white lines, giving off the appearance of a bat rather than an umbrella that is swooping down to ensnare the headless man below. Fellow artist and by this time a close friend of Francis, Graham Sutherland, was immensely impressed with his work. This painting would prompt Sutherland to take advantage of his connections on Bacon's behalf once again, when he would contact a reputable dealer, Erica Browson, to get in touch with the new artist. Erica too was mesmerised by the unique and terrifying presence that the painting radiated, and so would purchase the painting and exhibit it almost all around the world at many different group exhibitions, from the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, throughout the late 40s. He would also land himself a long-term residency at Browson's Hanover Gallery for a further 12 years. Things would seem on the up for the recently shy and reserved Francis Bacon, but of course, he was still young and somewhat reckless. By the time his 1946 painting was bought by Erica, Francis would move back to France, this time to the southern coast, at the French Riviera district of Monte Carlo in Monaco. Monte Carlo was famous back in the day for being a sort of haven for those who lived for the gambling lifestyle, which of course Francis knew all too well. Ever since childhood, when his father Edward Bacon would get his son to place bets at the bookies for him, the only real bonding time he and his father ever shared. Gambling has always seemed to surround him, and Francis relished it. The roulette tables in Monte Carlo, considered to be Bacon's favourite method of gambling, worked more in the player's favour according to their rules. The French version had 1 rather than 2 zeros on the wheel, the game was slower paced, and the wheel was placed at the centre rather than at the head, allowing for a more social experience with the game. The player, should they choose to do so, could also play on more than one table at once, due to the slower pace of the game, widening the odds for a win. As we know, the concept of chance, risk and gambling when it came to Bacon's art was considered extremely vital to him, but outside the art studio, this obsession and such little attachment to money would cause the artist to stack up numerous debts. Despite the unthinkable huge winnings that Bacon would achieve in the casinos, the debts would appear again and frequently after he would bet his winnings away. Aside from his gambling habits, his asthma was also beginning to subside in the more pleasant Mediterranean climate. Although he loved the unrelenting sunshine, it did unfortunately hinder his ability to concentrate on painting, and in fact, he scarcely completed any paintings while abroad, leaving no works to survive from 1947. The hot sun, the seedy nightlife, and the beckoning roulette tables would continue to hinder Bacon's productivity up until about 1948. Bacon would continue to write to Erica Browson in an attempt to reassure her he was still hard at work, and he may well have been outside our knowledge, but even so, he had no paintings to show for it. And as the money continued to run out, so did his likeliness of obtaining another advance. On top of this, Bacon was fast approaching the deadline for his first ever solo exhibition at Browson's Hanover Gallery, which would take place on November 1949. By this time, Francis had no choice but to return to his more familiar studio in London, free of distractions and the Mediterranean sun, to hastily complete what is known as the Head series. These paintings, featuring pale, obscure figures, are expertly executed, yet at the same time, they're far more subdued and relatively more simple than his previous works, most likely as a result of him creating them with very little time to spare before the Hanover Gallery exhibition opened in 1949. Created periodically, either the year before or only a few months beforehand, each painting possesses its own unique, haunting quality. However, one particular painting would stand out from the others as the star of the show. Head 1, for example, created in 1948, captures Bacon's desire to truly move away from the influence of Picasso, to explore a darker and more conceptual style of figurative art, with a more monochrome palette and subtle yet threatening displays of facial features. He delves into his fascination with the screaming mouth once again, making this painting undeniably that of Bacon. But this time the face is more obscure, not quite clear on where it begins and ends, almost appearing like it's melting or pulling away from the ear and fading into the background like smoke. The teeth of the figure, as opposed to the three studies, are more animalistic this time, like fangs or the canines of some predator. Instead of a bright background, this time we are presented with a tight, dark space that contains the figure within. These dark rooms of claustrophobic-inducing qualities would become yet another key trademark in later Bacon paintings. The Head series would also be the start of a new technique that he would continue to use until his final days, in applying paint to the wrong side of a canvas. According to the online Francis Bacon biography on francisbacon.com, Bacon stated that he had used up all of his primed canvases and decided, perhaps out of desperation, to take one off its stretcher and try working on the other side. He found the raw canvas held the paints with a bit more bite, enhanced its texture, and allowed thinner applications to soak into the canvas. And Bacon found a technique precisely attuned to his temperament. But this is not the painting that would really steal the show that day. The main spotlight would go to that of Head 6, created in 1949. The figure is specifically a recreation of Diego Velázquez's portrait of Pope Innocent X, created in 1650, identified by his robes that seem to match with those in a historical painting. Again, we are presented with a screaming mouth, and as we explored in part 1, he was heavily inspired by the still in the battleship Potemkin film, an influence that makes its appearance here, but in this painting the mouth seems cavernous and deep, almost as if it's a mouth within a mouth. There are uses of black and dark grey paint again, but this time used to minimal effect. The brownish hue is created simply by the untreated canvas underneath. We're also presented with yet another claustrophobic space, like that of a glass box, muting the screams of a figure trapped inside. Bacon would later comment on the painting, saying that he wanted to paint the scream more than the horror. I think if I had really thought about what causes somebody to really scream, it would have made the scream more successful. The Head series, despite being a somewhat rushed project, proved in the end to be a successful first solo exhibition at the Hanover Gallery. Up until this point, although he was highly respected, Francis was still generally regarded as a one-hit wonder with his Free Studies paintings, but now he had proven his brilliance was consistent. It could be argued that had Francis ignored the critics and continued to implement his influence of Picasso like in the Free Studies, he may have still been considered as a one-hit wonder. However, of course, his art was still disturbing and unnerving a lot of viewers at the exhibition, solidifying his reputation as a controversial post-war artist. A critic for The Observer would later write on the event as follows: "The recent paintings, horrifying as they are, cannot be ignored. technically they are superb, and the masterly handling of large areas of pearly grey, flushed with a sudden pink or green, only makes me regret the more that the artist's gifts should have been brought to subjects so esoteric. Now truly a famous artist, or at least a notable newcomer, Bacon had achieved the next stage of his capabilities as a painter. Had he not completed the Head series in such a rushed manner that he did, it's possible that the foundation for his distinctive and more refined style in his later works would not be to the same result and quality. It allowed him to let go, to leave things more to chance as he intended, and to give in more willingly to his own ideas rather than those of other artists. So if anyone at this point believed Bacon just to be another one-trick pony, the opening at the Hanover Gallery had triumphantly proven them otherwise. During 1950, the relationship of Francis Bacon and long-term partner Eric Hall was beginning to take its toll. Although the Tory representative had now left his wife and children, there was no denying the age gap of a couple that restricted and limited their mutual interests. Hall was now just over 60, and by this time he had little patience or desire left to accompany his younger lover in the smoky nightclubs, with yet even more young men now trying to make the world their own. Following the end of their relationship would also be the departure of Bacon's beloved nanny, Nanny Lightfoot, who would pass away on April the 30th, 1951. Francis would then leave his home and art studio of Cromwell Place, deeply wounded and hurt by the death of Nanny Lightfoot, and would wander from studio to studio for the next 10 years. Francis would then take an unexpected trip to the shores of South Africa after his mother Winifred had moved there after her husband and Bacon's father Eddie had passed away. Her two daughters and sisters of Francis, Ianthe and Winifred, had also moved to Africa, in the neighbouring country of modern-day Zimbabwe, at the time known as Southern Rhodesia. It would be this exotic landscape, soulful culture and rich abundance of weird and wonderful wildlife that would spark a new inspiration in Francis. In this painting, completed in 1952, called Study for a Figure in a Landscape, we can see the inspiration Francis took from seeing wild animals moving through the long grass of the plains in Africa. He would also during this time visit Egypt, and illustrate the Sphinx of Giza on more than one occasion, after developing a huge admiration for ancient Egyptian art. 1952 would prove to mark a significant period for Francis, as during this year he would cross paths and become romantically involved with a man named Peter Lacey, a former Spitfire pilot and veteran of the Battle of Britain, an encounter that would later manifest into the darkest, yet arguably one of the most important influences on Bacon's art that emerged in the 50s and 60s, and he would even star in a few of Bacon's later works. From 1953 onwards, the art of Francis Bacon was becoming more abundant and diverse than ever before, and not least of all unsettling, such as his 1953-54 Men in Blue series, featuring 7 paintings of a man sat at a darkened bar from different angles and poses, simple yet powerfully foreboding, to yet even more screaming and mutilated faces of anguish and despair that seem to improve in not only technical skill and detail, but in execution of the concept and subject that Bacon was trying to portray, such as his 3 studies for the human head triptych from 1953, executed in a style of near photographic realism, with the face contorting, screaming and grimacing in different and uncomfortable ways. A lot of the paintings from this period would also feature displays of life model posing, such as these paintings inspired and based on photographs taken from a book that Bacon owned called Human Figure in Motion, which would ultimately serve as Bacon's sort of visual dictionary for a great deal of his other paintings. The most famous and familiar star of his 1950s paintings, though, would of course be the many appearances of the Pope. His most famous example, again emerging in 1953, is called Study after Velasquez's portrait of Pope Innocent X. We can once again see the screaming face of a nurse from battleship Potemkin, with broken spectacles hiding the eyes as if he's been brutally bludgeoned. The space that the Pope is contained in appears to be more expansive, but the illusion of a terrible cage is made evident by the thick, sharp streaks of black paint that seem to drape over the figure from top to bottom. As the 50s continued, the eyes of the public could not help but notice an increase of incredibly violent displays as well as unsettling ones. Although Bacon's art had always been considered as disturbing, something else had changed. The central focus of a lot of paintings released in the latter parts of the 50s were around a face or body that appeared to be horribly beaten, bruised or disfigured by blunt trauma, something not quite seen to this extreme within the art world before. Bruised eyes, swollen lips, and broken noses were beginning to intrude the ominous backgrounds of his paintings. Although Bacon was highly talked about by this time, he was still particularly gifted at keeping his life behind closed doors. But now something was beginning to escape onto canvas from behind those doors, something violent, malevolent, and tumultuous. Just who or what was inspiring Bacon to create such images, and just what kind of person exactly was this new Peter Lacy that Francis had fallen for and who was beginning to appear in his paintings? And that is it for part 2. Thank you so much for watching. Before I go, it's that time again for Artist Corner, where I get to share and discuss some art sent in by one of my viewers. And today's featured artist is Neville Barbour. Neville is an American conceptual artist from Washington, DC, but now currently resides in Silver Spring in Maryland. Neville's chosen medium is drawing with charcoal. As he tells me, he finds profound satisfaction in taking a medium that can easily be messy and fiddly and trying to clean it up a bit, adding sharp and precise outlines and intricate shading, making it go against its flow like living in a contradiction. Neville says it's also very important to him to make art that focuses on ambivalence. It is both a necessary emotion and a sign of maturity. At first, when I saw the thumbnail images for these drawings, I thought they were black and white photographs with a bit of enhancing and experimental editing here and there. I was stunned to realise at closer inspection though, and after reading Neville's story, that these are drawings and they're achieved with photorealistic quality. Neville's attention to detail in these drawings is absolutely world class and expertly done, and each drawing radiates a beautiful representation of his chosen theme. My personal favourite has to be the one titled Moonlight, which Neville was kind enough to give me a description for that highlights a very thought-provoking subject matter. The consistency of sin is that it is ever-changing. What was taboo in a previous era is sometimes considered quite ordinary in the next. The word sin is in fact derived from the name of a Babylonian moon deity, and like the ever-changing faces of the moon, the definition of sin transforms. This depiction of a moon goddess is composed with elements similar to that of yin and yang. They both show the juxtaposition of the light and darkness shifting to find balance. There is such a tranquility in this drawing, but there is also something quite chaotic about it. The expression of the moon goddess, for me at least, is calm and confident, but at the same time is very fragile, as if she's detached from the world. These drawings you see here, as well as many other fantastic charcoal drawings, are available on his website that you see here, as well as on his Instagram, @Neville Barbour. I highly recommend you check out more of his stuff, especially if you want some new art to experience that explores a very unique concept. As Neville says, ambivalence is the glue between happiness, sadness, joy and rage. We feel ambivalent quite often, but seldom mention it. It is truly a fascinating outlook on life that can have many benefits to most of us. I just want to say a big thank you to Neville for sending me his work. If you too are an artist, photographer, sculpturist or anything in between, and you'd like to potentially feature in a future video, please send me examples of your art to blinddweller@gmail.com, or feel free to contact me on Twitter should you wish. And as always, I would like to thank my top tier channel members for this month: Carol Hartung, Ken B, Garrett Greathouse and Wendy Go. Thank you for your donations guys, it really helps me and this channel grow and keep these videos coming. If you too want a shout out in future videos or want to see any of my videos early, please consider hitting a join button and becoming a member today for as little as $2.99 a month. Thank you again for watching everyone, and see you next time for part 3 coming real soon. Bye for now.